Hi everyone, welcome to another speed tutorial. This one is my latest picture. It took me 3 hours to paint and this speed tutorial is only 23 minutes. Wow! So let me go through all of the steps with you and then you can see if you can create it or the full tutorial will come out later. So I started with 2 pictures from Pixabay and I just combined them and created my own background. After I had my pictures, I transferred the images as I wanted them to the canvas, and I'm now applying some masking fluid to cover up the parakeets and just some of the highlighted areas like the flowers, etc. Now this method that you see me using, I'm using 2 little dishes. One has some dish soap, and I coat my synthetic brush with the dish soap, and then I can dip that dedicated brush into my masking fluid. And that way it's really easy to wash out the masking fluid later. Otherwise it cakes and is quite the mess. You do not want to use your real nice brushes for this. Guaranteed you'll destroy them. So I have actually dedicated brushes for my masking fluid. And I'm very careful to use a springy, very acrylic style of brush, and it gives me a lot of detail. I was also careful to make really smooth lines with that. That's because the parakeet it doesn't have feathery effect. It's a very smooth contour on this particular parakeet. Okay, once the masking fluid is down and completely dried, I can start getting my canvas wet. So I'm using Fabriano Artistico hot pressed paper. It has to be hot pressed because of the detail work that I do. And now I'm getting it very, very wet. Many layers of water. And you probably saw me tap the middle of the canvas or away from the edge when I first put in the water. That's because I didn't want that bead to run down the side. After I put on several layers of water, it's quite damp, it's starting to buckle a little bit, then I can apply my paints. And I'm starting with a very light one. This is one of my favorite colors. It is green gold. I love this color. It dries quite nicely. It's a great background color. It doesn't flow really well in the water, and so I have to push it around. And right here you see me tapping the canvas just because I want to leave that spot particularly light. So if I put a little color there, I'll tap it out with just a dry towel. Another of my favorite colors is undersea green. Now a lot of my colors have been chosen because they harmonize really well. I have a certain style of painting and I don't really go for the bright colors. I have bright colors, but I don't use a lot of them. But this is green gold and undersea green. They just beautifully complement each other. And they blend really well together. You'll notice that I'm leaving a lot of gaps here and there on the canvas. That's because in the traditional rainforest, in your typical rainforest, there is filtered light. So you're going to have areas of white or maybe softer colors, and so later when I put more and more layer on top, some of these areas are not going to be colored in, and it's going to be like recreating the atmosphere of a rainforest. So this is another green. I believe this one is serpentine or Amazon. I wasn't really paying attention. I was just dipping my brush happily into the paints. And this particular blue it's a mixture. I have Indian throne blue, probably a little touch of French ultramarine, but it's got a little green in it too, just so that it blends well with these colors. I don't want things to kind of be competitive in coloring. I want the colors to blend nicely. This is one of my brighter colors. This is definitely phthalo blue, and I only put the phthalo blue in the top area and just some smaller areas to create kind of a reflection of light and a brighter look, but for the most part I want a darker blue for this rainforest. tapping around. I want to create kind of a blurry effect too. Filtered light kind of blurs. You know, I have bokeh effect. Bokeh effect is kind of hard to get, so if I just tap a little bit, I'm still getting kind of a filtered light through the leaf look. And here we have some reds. This is perylene red. Putting it in where I'm going to be putting my flowers, and then I'll put the flowers on top, and it's like there's a blur of color there around where we're only going to have 2 or 3 of the orchids in detail. Okay, moving along to layer 2. Everything is now dry, and this time I'm not putting a lot of water on. I should really only do 1 swipe with the brush, but I did 2. Usually on this, or sometimes on the second round when you're swiping, you're going to start picking up color or disturbing that color underneath. I could see that I blurred a little bit, but that's okay. I'm going to be putting more on top. Also note I was very lightly touching the canvas with that brush, so maybe it's okay. And this is negative painting. I'm doing a little negative painting, trying to create a leaf in the foreground, and just putting in some other colors. Now my parakeet is going to be a very light color, so I need to put dark colors next to it. And because all of these colors fade, I'm going to have to put in more layer. So more negative painting the other side of that leaf. Now I got my brush damp, and I kind of drug out those colors so I don't have a hard line on the south or on the lower part. And you're probably wondering if it's okay to paint over that masking. I've never had a problem. I have had a problem by not putting enough masking down, and when I painted over it I would leave some kind of blurriness or maybe color seeping through that I didn't expect. And I actually had that here on one of the flowers, or maybe it was beside the left parakeet. So later in the video maybe you can see where it really was kind of messy. I went over all of the parakeets twice with masking. I was very careful to make sure that they had heavy masking, and they're going to be really light green. It would be really hard to pick up any kind of paint that had seeped through. Now, of course, that depends on the paint. So if you are painting with green gold, that's a really easy color to lift. You can activate it later with, just put some water on it, scrub it a little gently with a brush, and just dab it up with a dry towel. But if you're painting with phthalo green, phthalo blue, you are in for a nightmare. It's just not going to pick up. So specifically on the parakeets, I put down 2 layers. I didn't do that on the flowers. Oops. So I'm just going around adding some kind of rainforest textures and leaves or whatever. This particular leaf I love. It's really easy. My silver black velvets are very pointed, and I can just fill them up with paint. I can put a lot of pressure on, make them flattened. They're pointed on the end, and then lift really abruptly, and I have a long, narrow leaf. It's fantastic. By the way, this is my favorite brush. Silver black velvet. Remember that. You'll hear about it again and again. I'm working layer by layer now. I did the right side, a little bit damper background, and then put in some more color, and now I'm doing the left side, or just an area. And then testing the top part to make sure that it's dry before I start adding the detail. So now I'm no longer working wet and wet or damp and wet, and it's all going to be pretty much wet on dry now. And with wet on dry, I am specifically looking at the finer details. Sometimes I will take a wet brush and with color and paint an area. Sometimes I'll dampen the area and then drop in paint. Both ways work, and it really depends on what I'm painting in that area. For these flower petals, I usually tend to paint with a loaded brush and, water and paint. But on occasion, I noticed that I did, dampen an area and then drop in some paint. And then to create harmony in the picture, I'm actually adding a little of the same color in the background, but these colors are going to be different than in the front. In the front or the foreground, they are on white or very, very light paper. In the background, they're on blues and purples, and those colors will just kind of tone down, and I'm not adding any more color for the most part to those in the background. So only the ones in the foreground are going to be brilliant, and they're the ones that will pop. And the reason behind this is you just don't want the eye going all over the canvas. You want to focus the eye on a certain area, and my focus is the two parakeets and maybe some of those flowers. At this time I realize I'm needing some contrast, and so I thought, well, okay, I'll pop in a vine. The vine can be quite dark, and this is kind of browns and oranges, maybe some green mixed in. I put in a darker vine, and then I put in an orange wrapping vine. Very easy. And then I mixed up some darker colors with some purples, maybe some indanthrone blue in it. And that's how I'm getting this twisty, like filaments that are hanging off of the vine. Okay, so now it's time to remove that masking. And I put a lot of flicking in the top part and in the lower left. So I have to run my hand over, make sure that I picked up all of those little itty bitty pieces. The big pieces are quite easy. There are many ways to remove masking, and I have a dedicated tool. But if you don't have one, you can put your finger in a plastic bag and it will rub up so easily. My next stage, I'm trying to recapture some of the light areas, because you'll notice that I have a lot of dark leaves and vines, and I want to put in some graduated color to recapture some of the light. And an easy recapture method is to just dip a very firm synthetic brush into some water, it's just to dampen it, not to get it wet, and then rub a certain area back and forth, lift up that, the paint, and then dab it up with a towel. Now, like I said before, it might work with some paints, and others like the phthalos, it's just not going to work so well. One of the areas that I did a lot of lifting was between, like the fern leaves. There's more, there's a little bit of light coming between these long, slender leaves, and that's where I did a lot of lifting. I put some texture on different leaves. If it was a large area that was dark blue or dark green, I tried to lift something out or recreate some kind of other kind of leaf structure or texture in there. Anyway, the eye will pick up on that. Now I'm painting in some color. Before I had some leaves, flower petals that needed to be painted, and others that I had covered. And the reason I covered some is I wanted some to be pure red or pure orange. I didn't want any undercolor to be contaminating them. But obviously I didn't paint a lot in that area, so I probably didn't even need to mask. Anyway, always good to know. Each of those petals, I try to vary the color a little bit. So I tend to paint a lighter color, and then I'll drop in some darker color. After I drop in some darker color along the edge, I will even put in maybe a red, because these are oranges and reds and yellows. I'll put in a red or a darker, whatever the color is, I'll put it in darker along the edge. There are so many kinds of orchids, and so hopefully the eye will say, yes, I see an orchid when they see these. And these colors harmonize so well with the greens and blues. Like I said before, I chose my palette based off of colors that I can pretty much mix most things in my palette, and I'm not going to have any kind of color that's going to be totally gross next to each other. I mean, if you blend some of the colors, they will be gross, but next to each other, they should look quite nice. Okay, now for the moment we've all been waiting for. Let's paint those parakeets. Here, I'm surprisingly using that synthetic brush. It doesn't hold a lot of water. It's very stiff, and it holds a very stiff edge, so it's really good for lifting. But surprisingly, I didn't change brushes. Anyway, I'm using the flat of the brush, and I don't need a lot of water. I'm putting down just a little color, and you can see that I've only mixed basically two colors here, two little paint pools. I do have a dark, add water sometimes, so sometimes it's darker, other times it's lighter. But basically these are two paint pools. I'm using cobalt teal blue for one, and the other one, I think it's the Amazon. And in my paint palette, these colors are side by side. One is more granulating than the other. One has a little bit more green texture, and I did add a little green. That's not pure Amazon. So basically you can take three colors, the cobalt, Amazon, and maybe the green gold, and you've pretty much got the colors you need for these parakeets. Now these parakeets had very lovely dark rings. The rings had purples and oranges depending on the light. And the two pictures that I have, I blended two pictures. One had a kind of purple ring around the neck, and the other had more of a blue. Very nice variety. And I don't know if this has to do with male or female. I know that, like the budgie parakeet that you have, like many people have in the houses. We had one when I was a kid. One had a blue bill, and one had a greenish brown. Anyway, the female had the brown bill after 3 years, and the male had a blue bill after 3 years, and that 3 years is their maturity rate. On this one, I have no idea, but both of the bills that were in the pictures, they were bright red with a little bit of purple or darker color underneath. I put purple. And those colors really pop against the green, that light kind of lemon lime green. The right parakeet had a lot more texture in the wings, of course. You're going to be seeing a lot of the wings. So I was really careful to add different kinds of feathering and texture, but for the most part, these parakeets are very sleek animals. They don't seem to get fluffy like, the traditional budgie parakeet that most of us are familiar with. These guys have very sleek bodies. So when I did the masking, I was very careful to use one line on the body to bring that line down so that it didn't look like there was fluffy feathers here and there. The most detail that was in this parakeet on the right was in the pin feathers. It had a little bit of, feather definition up in the upper parts of the wings, but it was those pin feathers I'm painting right now, and the tail, just a little bit in the tail, it showed some more definition and color variation. But for the most part, this thing was green. Lovely green, limey green. I'm adding only the lightest of texture, the lightest of detail. The eye will pick it up, but it's not heavy detailing at all. So little flecks for around the face, on some of the upper wings, and right here on the tail, just a little bit here. The pin feathers on the tail were somewhat pronounced though. Just straight, nothing fine. I did mix in a little bit of the French ultramarine, a little bit, with the cobalt, and just that blend was able to get more of a turquoise, which was kind of good for this bird. Now I'm taking my very large brush, and I had the details down, and I'm just glazing over a light green, kind of to create harmony of the color and to make it look like it's a green bird, which it is. On the left, I didn't really do that much detailing, very little, and you can see that I did most of it with my large silver black velvet, size 8. And now I'm using a nail brush, or maybe this is a Young Eel Korean brand size 00 for detailing around the eye. I needed a very tiny point for that. I often use a nail brush, but this Young Eel works beautifully. And while I can get excellent detail with this, silver black velvet, I do need to get some of that finer, like the smoothness of the line with the Young Eel size 0, and that's where I'm just, putting in that light line between the two beaks, upper and lower. It's good for pupil work, good for outlining the eyes, and for just dropping in little textures for feathers. And another thing about this Young Eel is it has a very sharp point, very few, bristles on it, and it's very firm. Some brushes tend to be a little bit more wobbly or softer. This one is very firm, so I can get really fine detail with it. Just some last minute texture on those wings, that's all I need. Okay, we're now into one of the very final stages, and that's the background additions. The birds are done, and now we have to create harmony. So I added some dark paint around the tail just to, make more contrast with that green. I'm also adding some little textures, more leaves, more rainforest kind of foliage. Just trying to create more of a sense of, wildness. And I do this throughout. I do it in many colors. And now for the last stage, and that is to touch up some white. So this is gouache, and I have a kind of a dedicated brush for this because gouache tends to mess up my beautiful silver black velvet because it's kind of like, it's synthetic hair, but it acts like real fur. It clumps and clogs and blah. So this is a dedicated brush. I use one for mixing, a wider one, and now I'm using my Young Eel size 00 for doing the detail work. And throughout this, I put in little bits of white here and white there. I outline some of the leaves. I pop in some filaments on those flowers. And I add a lot around the birds, as you can see from the flower textures that I created. Anyway, because this was a 3-hour paint, the last 15 minutes or so I lost the footage for how I added that gouache, but it's pretty good, I guess. So I really hope you enjoyed this 23 sped up version. The full version will be out soon. Hit the like, hit the subscribe, and wait for the new version. I'll see you again later.